Between a Rock and Harlan's Place is the 4th episode of the 1st season of Will and Grace. This is directed by the wonderful James Burrows, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. I'm kind of almost at the point where I'm ready to go through the show scene by scene. With a lot of my sitcom reviews, I will go through things pretty much scene by scene, in the case of Cheers, almost line by line, and I feel like I'm pretty much in a good place with Will and Grace where I can start to do that. I've seen, 4 episodes now, so I'll go through things basically scene by scene, but things might get more in depth as I carry on with the show. What's really interesting about this one for me is that I'm sure I've seen this episode before, but I've never watched the show before. I'd seen the first episode before when I tried to watch it a few years ago, but for some reason I have seen this episode. And that's quite telling to me that I could remember this random episode of a random TV show I'd otherwise never seen, and I could still recall quite a few elements. I think that's a pretty good sign. So it starts off with Will asking, kind of telling Grace that she should do some interior design for Harlin. And Grace doesn't want to do this because she thinks Will just butt in and get in the way, as he apparently always does. But Will had kind of already told Harlan she'd do it, so she agrees after kind of throwing spaghetti across the room in a very random moment. And she agrees as long as Will doesn't interfere, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. Jack then comes in with an amazing entrance, really fabulous way to enter a room, and announces he has big news. And we sit on that for maybe a minute, until he reveals what the big news is, and basically he's decided, he's come to the conclusion that the direction in his life that he needs is to start a singing career. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to perform in an open mic night under the act of Just Jack, which I have to say is a pretty cool performance name. And I love the transition to the next scene, because we go from Jack telling Will about this to then telling Karen about this. He goes to Grace's office to tell Karen, and then Harlan goes to see Grace, and that just moved things so smoothly. Harlan also talks with Karen, and that becomes important. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Harlan then goes to speak with Grace, and the next thing we know, we're in the apartment very quickly. I could remember the episode, but I couldn't remember the pacing or anything. And I kind of had expected them to do the big reveal of the apartment a little bit later on, but it is in the next scene. And it's very cluttered. It's very what is described as Texas chic, which I think is a good term for it, but it's very, very cluttered. And as Will puts it, the furniture is just hollowed out animals, which I think, not for me. I don't want to be sitting on hollowed out animals, bears and other animals. Very, not to my taste. And Will does try to butt in, and he doesn't come outright with it, but he does make some remarks that Harlan might have picked up on. I think Grace's emotions were not necessarily realistic at this stage, because she goes home, she's eating, I think, cheesecake, and is really angry at Will for butting in. But I feel like she was overreacting, because at that point, things hadn't gone badly. Yes, Will had maybe broken his promise, but she was still doing the job. So I think she was overreacting. I've kind of realised so far that I don't agree with a lot of Grace's emotions. And I really hope that this doesn't continue going forward, because if I feel like she overreacts a lot, it's going to make her very difficult to like. I don't dislike her in this episode, but it is a sign of what could be to come. But I'll reserve judgment for a little bit longer. And she does actually have a valid reason to be upset, but she doesn't know it yet. We do then find out, after she starts telling Will that her ideas were great and that he shouldn't have butted in, which is a fair point, we find out that Harlan fired her. And needless to say, she's upset about this. And we're then back with Karen and Jack, and she's helping him learn to dance to put a bit of an energy into his performance. And it gets really awkward when they're dancing around the world, and it's kind of like they're Velcroed together. It beautifully moved. The choreography is brilliant, but it's very, very weird and very awkward. But it works really well. And then we're at the performance where we are for the rest of the episode, and Jack is obviously there, and so is Will, and it turns out so is Harlin. Harlin went because he thought Karen might go, because obviously when he went into the office to speak with Grace, Jack was there telling Karen about his performance, and that's how Harlan was aware of it. And that, I thought, was a really nice way to also further move the narrative, because Harlan then speaks with Will, and it turns out the reason Harlan fired Grace, also I feel like if he's going to fire her, he should have done it to her face or phoned her, not just told Will. I feel like that's bad practice, but nevertheless, he tells Will that the reason he didn't want to continue working with her is because of the tension between Will and Grace. So technically it was Will's fault. It wasn't because Will made him hate the decor, but it's because of Will's behaviour and the way he was acting. And obviously it was quite tense between them. And just the words of Harlan saying it was because of Will, and the way Will responded, I thought was absolutely brilliant. And he does tell Grace this during Jack's performance. And while Jack is performing, really great performance, Will and Grace are getting louder and louder and louder. Largely, Will is getting louder until he ends up standing up and shouting out and interrupting the performance. And Jack's response when he said it's just Jack was just absolutely brilliant. And we end the scene with Will and Grace, or the episode rather, with Will and Grace working on a piece of paper, I think it was a napkin, to make it a little bit more legal, even though it probably wouldn't stand up in court, for Will to never butt in again, which was a fun way to end things, and it was nice that the tension between them had kind of dissipated. Jack's performance was pretty good for Jack, and we end on a pretty comfortable note. Everything's back to normal and nobody's fighting with each other, even though there might be a little bit of tension, but mostly it's all gone away now. And in general, it was not a bad way to end things. I quite liked the episode. As I said, I could remember the room, the apartment where we had all of these animal carcasses and things, and it's very well done. The fact that I can remember that, even though I'd never seen the show before. I must have just been watching it like in a hotel room or something. I don't know. But the fact that I could remember it even a little bit, despite the fact that I had no references, I didn't know who the characters were, I had no idea what I was watching other than the name of the show, I find that pretty impressive. And my memory's terrible, so that tells me that it's a very memorable episode, at least the scene where we see the apartment. And I don't think I have any personal highlights yet. Well, when Grace flicked the spaghetti across the room accidentally, I don't know why. It wasn't so much the flicking of the spaghetti, it was the pause when she turned to look at it. It was just brilliant, very well done. And Jack's just whole behaviour at the venue I thought was brilliant. He was having a bit of a diva moment, which I quite liked. And in general, it's a good episode. I'm not yet in love with the show. I'm not there yet. I'm not obsessed about it. I look forward to it. I was looking forward to watching this episode, but I think that's largely currently more out of curiosity, not quite knowing what to expect. Whereas as I get deeper into it, I'm hoping to change that from curiosity to excitement and real enthusiasm. And I feel like there is the potential for that. So fingers crossed, if nothing else, I will continue with the entirety of the first season because I've paid for it twice. So I might as well carry on. But I'm enjoying it. Not yet obsessed, but still having fun. And I can say that Between a Rock and Harlan's Place was a pretty enjoyable episode of Will and Grace.